a thesis that you've put forward that I find very compelling is that the current world order, the post-World War II order, the monolithic US as global hegemon, those world orders are done. They're already dead. And maybe you're watching the death throes or whatever, but the new world order is coming. And I want to understand, what does the new world order look like? And as with Iran as pivot point, what does it look like? How does this play out? How deep do we go? And why is there no sort of ability to preserve the current world order?
First of all, the current global economic order is based on the premise of cheap oil, right? Because cheap oil is the basis for everything. Like from the Strait of Hormuz, you don't just have energy, you also have fertilizer, which allows you to grow food. You also have sulfuric acid, which is what allows you to process semiconductors. Okay, so cheap oil, cheap energy is the basis for the entire global economy. The reality is the Strait of Hormuz is not going to open tomorrow. It's probably going to stay closed for the next few years, meaning like the world loses access to cheap oil. Okay, so we need to think ahead and see what this means for the rest of the world. And so I would say there are three major trends that we should expect in the next 4 to 5 years. All right, and I think these trends will be very, very salient. So the first major trend is de-industrialization and de-urbanization, meaning that it doesn't really make sense to have millions of people live in cities doing digital work. Why? Because the economy is not balanced. You need people to grow food, and then you need manufacturing as well. Before, you didn't have to worry about this because it was a globalized economy where you can import food, all right? And like, just think about how, if you're a middle-class American, you basically have a higher standard of living than the Roman emperor, because you could, every day go to the supermarket and eat avocados, cherries. You can have food from all around the world all the time. And again, this is because of access to cheap oil. But those days are gone. And basically, like, economies need to become a much more balanced economy. And that means moving people from the cities, especially young people, and moving them back to the rural areas so that they can grow food and be self-sufficient, okay? So that's gonna be trend number one. Trend number two is, like, before, globalization was the religion, was the faith of the times. But now that globalization is collapsing because American power can no longer support globalization, nations need to reassert themselves, okay? So you have the rise of nationalism, which then allows for remilitarization in order to protect their borders better, right? Because before, you could just rely on American military power for protection. But now you have to defend yourself, right? And you do that through rejuvenating people's sense of national pride and identity, okay? So nationalism, remilitarization is the second big trend. The third big trend is mercantilism, okay? Basically self-sufficient economic spheres around the world. And it's gonna look differently in different places, where Europe might be a trading bloc unto itself, but in other places, maybe Israel, maybe Japan, create their own economic zones through military power, all right? And then in the Northern Hemisphere, I think that America will come out okay, because really, I mean, like America is a superpower regardless, right? So America retreats from the rest of the world, but then it builds an economic system within the Western Hemisphere, and then it's fine. So we're seeing a rupture or splintering of the world, and going back basically to 1930s.
That's wild. Okay, so who are going to be the winners and who are going to be the losers in this?
Right. So basically, whichever nation is most able to embrace these trends and transform their economies from one that is globally dependent to much more nationally dependent will survive. Okay. So that's why I think that Japan in Asia is actually better positioned than China, because the Chinese economy is too export orientated. Okay, the Chinese economy just relies on dumping cheap goods onto the global market, and you can do that again with cheap oil and a global marketplace. But once nations start to go into war, and then they no longer trade, then China is forced to become much more insular. And unfortunately, the Chinese economy is not balanced, meaning like it's completely dependent on exports, and consumers don't actually have any demand because consumers don't have any capital. They don't have any savings to spend money on. Consumers are afraid of the future. They lack confidence. Okay, so China is in a very tough situation because the Chinese economy and Chinese planners are not able to make the transition from one that is a global economy to one that is a much more regional economy. Okay, Japan, on the other hand, has a history and a record of making radical transformations when the existence of the nation is at stake. Okay, so you just look at Japan, you think, oh my God, Japan is completely screwed because they have an aging crisis, because they are completely dependent on resources from abroad. They don't actually have their own oil, and the Japanese economy, it has been in a deflationary spiral for the past 20, 30 years. Okay, you think Japan is completely screwed, but when all hope seems lost, the Japanese somehow come together and then transform their entire system. Okay, and so so I'll give you a few examples where, in the 1200s or 1300s, when the Mongolians were coming to invade Japan, and Japan at this time was, like feudal system. They came together as a people, and we opposed the Mongolian invasion not once but twice. Okay, that's very impressive. Then they go to the Meiji Reformation, right, which is the mid-19th century, when China had already been carved up by the Western powers, and Japan's like, okay, we need to industrialize now, and they did so in 20 years. All right,
Wow.
so much so that Japan defeated Russia in the Russo-Japanese War. And then you go to the end of World War II, when the Japanese economy was completely devastated. So what happened? The Japanese people came together, and in 20 years' time, they became the world's dominant manufacturing power. Okay, the Japanese are a special people. Never ever bet against the Japanese. So even though the things look darkest for the Japanese, they are remarkably resilient people and cohesive people. So I think like they are the most likely to make the transformations necessary in order to survive the new global order. Another thing I will say is the aging crisis, where every industrial economy is suffering from the aging crisis, right? You have people living into the 90s, into the hundreds, and they're not working, but they are just consuming a lot of resources. And every industrial nation is going to suffer from this issue. But the Japanese are different, meaning like if the Japanese nation is under stress and there's a crisis, and the elderly in Japan need to make the necessary sacrifices in order for their grandchildren to survive, they will do so. And no other nation in the world will do this, okay? Get the baby boomers in America to make sacrifices for America. I mean, you can make the argument like a lot of the issues in America come from the fact that the baby boomers are a selfish, materialistic, and self-absorbed generation that refuse to surrender power, right? I mean, like look at how old their Congress is. You've got this guy Chuck Grassley. How old is he? Like 94 or something? He's still there. What is he doing?
Yeah, it is. I have to admit, it is pretty wild. Yeah, Japan is a unique case. It brings up the question. So you're talking about people are going to get more nationalistic because they're going to have to defend their own interests. And Japan is a special use case. Expect them to become a regional power because of their ability to coalesce, come together. Japan is also making waves here in the US because they're being so xenophobic and absolutely just deciding, we're not doing any more immigration, which is crazy given that they have this aging population, they have this demographic challenge, and they're gonna, get rid of one of the easiest, maybe not the best, but one of the easiest ways to deal with it. I've heard you say some things that to Western ears is quite striking about diversity not being a useful thing at this time. Talk to me a little bit about that. What's the thesis there?
Right. So the idea is that after World War II, there was a lot of discussion as to why World War II happened. And the agreement was excessive nationalism, right? these nations like Japan and Germany became fascist. And so what we need to do is dilute the national fever of people around the world, and then you have eternal peace. And so a concept that came into popularity at this time is something called the open society, where you have open borders, multiculturalism, diversity, and now celebrate it as a way to create common bonds among humanity. And for the longest time, this made a lot of sense. And clearly, I benefited from this because I was allowed to immigrate from a poor village in China to go to Toronto, and then get a full scholarship to study at Yale. So I clearly benefited from this system. But now we've reached an extreme where to have any sense of community, to want to belong to a group is considered racist and backward and provincial. And I think that's just wrong. I've been watching the spread of DEI in the United States, and I just think it's just like, it doesn't make any sense to me. I appreciate diversity. I appreciate multiculturalism, but to make it your official religion and to punish anyone who wants more balance in society, who wants to protect the American identity, I think it's just wrong. I think it's just fanatical. And I think that if you embrace too much multiculturalism, which is what the Europeans are doing, it will lead to eventually suicide, national suicide. Okay, so the example is in 2014, you have millions of these refugees from the Middle East fleeing war and terror created by the Americans, and they're going to Europe. And quite honestly, the Europeans did not have the capacity to absorb these millions, tens of millions of refugees. But Angela Merkel, the German chancellor, said, we can do this, okay? And it's been a dumpster fire for Europe, all right? You're talking about like civil war possibly emerging in Europe over the next 5 to 10 years. You look at what's happening in Britain, in France, their populations are being replaced. And I'm not saying refugees are bad. What I'm saying is that nations need to protect their own identity and value system, because that's what gives meaning and purpose to the local population. Yeah. I don't understand why people are allowed to immigrate wherever. It's absurd to me. Where I'm from Canada, and there are a lot of Canadians who hate the Liberal government of Canada because they're very authoritarian, and I'm one of them. Okay, but you just shouldn't be able to pack your bags and then move to America or Dubai or Singapore. You should have to stay where you are and fight for your community, because that's what we've done throughout human history. Like if we always had the option of if we're unhappy, just moving somewhere else, we would never have human civilization. Human civilization is a coming together of people with a common bond, with a common sense of identity, and then building on top of that, right? So I mean, I feel we've gone too far, and we've embraced. The very common phrase now, very popular phrase is suicidal empathy, right? Where you care too much about your neighbor, and when you should really be looking after your own house.
Yeah, that's an idea that's gaining a lot of traction here in the U.S. as we all think through how exactly do we deal with this problem. The thing that I've been trying to convince my audience of is that values matter. And so a lot of people are getting tangled up in this concept as if it were a race issue. It's not a race issue. When you find somebody that, say, shares your religion, but they're a completely different race than you, you're far more bonded over the fact that you share a religion than you are alienated that they don't look like you. And for some reason, especially here in the West, we have just told the story over and over and over that everything comes down to your skin color. But I just refuse to believe that that's the experience people are actually having. It comes down to, do you click with somebody? Do you guys view the world the same way? Do you enjoy each other's company? And if you look exactly like me, but I can't stand to be around you, I don't have any sense of affinity towards you whatsoever. That one's very strange to me. Now, speaking of that, as you were talking, sorry, go ahead.
I feel I want to jump in here. This is a very important point where DEI, multiculturalism, it's being used to justify the bureaucratization of society, right? So this is not so apparent in America, but if you go to Europe and Canada, it's really apparent where these nations are essentially authoritarian, where you say anything now, the police can come knock on your door.
It's
right?
crazy.
So you go to England where, if you are part of these like grooming gangs, well, the police don't come after you, but like if you post about grooming gangs, they'll come knock on your door, right? And so Franz Kafka writes about this in his book, The Trial, where bureaucrats don't bother with criminals because it's a pain in the ass. So they go after ordinary citizens because ordinary citizens are compliant, and it allows them to feel good about themselves and to, collect their paycheck. So that's what we're seeing throughout the Western world, not in America, but in Canada, and in Europe, where you have the rise of this bureaucratic overclass that justifies its existence by virtuous signaling, right? By stopping on people who want a sense of community and identity.